3 months after I sentenced Daniel Mercer, Luis Mendoza stopped in the hallway outside courtroom 4B and said, "My daughter sleeps again." He did not say it like he was thanking me. He said it like he was placing a fact in my hands and asking me not to drop it. I have been carrying that with me. This is the case it came from. I need to tell this the way I lived it, not from outside the room, but from the bench where I had to hold two things at once and not let either one fall. One was the sorrow current. It began with a decent act being answered with harm. The other was the grace current. It began later, when truth arrived after damage, and asked whether there was still any room left for repair. The source of the sorrow current was Friday, June 14, 2024, at 5:42 p.m., on level 2 of the parking garage at the Camelback Esplanade, 2400 East Camelback Road in Phoenix, Arizona. Luis Mendoza, who was 43, found a brown leather wallet near the concrete stop at space 218. Inside were 3 platinum credit cards, a driver's license, and $18,400 in cash and 2 bank bands. He had just come from a drywall job and still had white dust along the seam of one sleeve. He did what I wish nobody had to call rare. He took the wallet straight to the valet stand and waited. He did not count the money. He did not call out to strangers. He just stood there with both hands around a thing that did not belong to him and waited for the person it did belong to. That was the first fact in the file, and it stayed bright all the way to sentencing. I want to ask you something before I keep going. Have you ever seen someone do the right thing and then watch that right thing become the reason they got hurt? Subscribe, because if you stay with me, I will tell you how this courtroom tried to answer that without lying about what it cost. At 5:49 p.m., Daniel Mercer came down the elevator from the office tower looking for the wallet he had dropped while taking a phone call. He was 58 years old, owner of Mercer Commercial Holdings, and rich in the way some people wear like a second coat. Luis stepped forward and said he believed the wallet was his. The valet, Maria Chen, testified that Luis held it out carefully, almost politely, as if handing over something breakable. Then the room of that garage changed. Daniel opened the wallet, thumbed through the cash, and stopped. At 5:51 p.m., he told the valet to call security. At 5:54 p.m., he called 911 himself. In his testimony, he admitted what he said. I said he took some of it. He had not checked his car. He had not checked his jacket. He had not checked his own fear. He had only given it a target. By 6:17 p.m., Officer Brent Calloway had Luis in handcuffs beside the south stairwell. His 10-year-old daughter, Sophia, was there because Luis had picked her up after summer tutoring on the way home. She was holding a paper cup of strawberry frozen yogurt that had started dripping over her fingers. From the body camera video, I heard Luis say, very calmly, "Please check the cameras, sir." I heard him say it again after the cuffs were locked. When Luis walked into my courtroom for the first time, he did not look defeated. He looked like a man trying not to take up more room than the truth would allow. He sat with both feet flat on the floor. He folded his construction cap into a neat square and put it beside him. During a recess, while his wife whispered to their lawyer, he leaned over and tied Sophia's shoelace because it had come loose under the bench. That one small act told me something no file could. It told me that even inside a room built around what had been done to him, part of him was still turned toward care. I do not say that to make him saintly. I say it because I saw it. I also saw what the case had placed on his body. He held his shoulders as if waiting for another public mistake to fall on them. Both things were true. The first thing I noticed about Daniel Mercer in my courtroom was that he kept reaching for the knot of a tie he was not wearing. That kind of gesture matters to me. It tells me where a person's mind lives when their words are not speaking yet. He sat straight, expensive watch turned inward on his wrist, jaw set so tight I could see the muscles move when he swallowed. Then, just before we began, he opened his portfolio and flattened a folded note with blue marker stars on it. Later I learned it was from his son, Owen, who was in a treatment program in Tucson. It said, "Dad, answer when I call this time." That note had nothing to do with the charges. It had everything to do with who he still was outside them. In the same breath, I also had to remember that a human being is more than the worst act he commits, and still fully answer for that act. That is part of what the bench asks of me. If you are still with me, you have probably gotten quieter. Maybe your hand stopped moving. Maybe the room around you has faded a little because you can already feel where this went. Subscribe. That kind of attention deserves the rest of the story. Subscribe and turn on notifications. When the case file first crossed my desk, it was thick with the kind of paper that tells you a small public moment kept hurting people after it should have ended. There were security stills from the garage, the 911 transcript, body camera logs, jail intake records, lost wage statements, and one school counselor note for Sophia. There was also a voicemail Daniel left at 12:14 a.m. when he found the missing $5,000 in the inside pocket of the sport coat he had thrown into the back seat of his BMW. Before I tell you about that call, I want to explain one court detail most people never see. Before sentencing, I can order a pre-sentence report. That is not just a summary of charges. It is a document prepared for the court that looks at harm, history, treatment needs, work, family, risk, and what kind of sentence might actually change behavior instead of just naming it. I do not use it to excuse people. I use it to avoid pretending that punishment without structure is wisdom. The path of the sorrow current ran through what happened after the handcuffs. Luis spent 14 hours in county jail. He missed his Saturday shift and then lost the next week of work because his employer said customers had seen the arrest footage shared online and did not want drama on a remodel site. 3 days later, his landlord posted a late rent notice on his apartment door. The school counselor wrote that Sophia had started asking whether police take good people by mistake, a lot or only sometimes. I watched the body camera footage in open court. That is where the first hard weight of the sorrow current truly settled into the room. Sophia asked, "Dad, was returning it bad?" She did not cry when she said it. That made it worse. A child asking that question means trust has already been bent. I stopped the video for a moment because I needed one breath before I could keep going. Nobody moved much after that. My court reporter's hands stayed above the keys but did not touch them. Luis looked down at the table. Daniel did not look at anybody. I remember the sound of the air vent above the jury box more clearly than I remember my own breathing. That is how still it got. The source of the grace current began 6 hours later at 12:14 a.m. on June 15th, when Daniel called Detective Rosa Ibarra and said, "I found the money. Release him. This is my fault." He said it twice. He did not ask first how to limit the damage. He did not ask how to protect his name. He said the truth before anyone had to drag it out of him. That did not cancel the lie. It did bring something necessary into the record. The grace current kept moving the next morning when Daniel's lawyer called the prosecutor and said her client did not want the case buried in a private settlement. He wanted the charges to stand if the facts supported them. People hear that and think it sounds noble. I did not hear it that way. I heard a man arriving late to the truth and at least not asking to be carried the rest of the way. The first time both currents moved close enough for me to feel them together came during Maria Chen's testimony. She said Luis never raised his voice in the garage. She said that while Daniel was accusing him, Luis kept saying, "Check your pockets again." I wrote that down. There it was. Sorrow in the accusation. Grace in the fact that the accused man was still trying to help the accuser find the truth. Here is what I am offering. The rest of this story told without cleaning it up before it earns that. I am offering the whole room as I remember it, including what hurt and including what opened. Subscribe if that is what you want. I will keep going. Luis testified on the second day. He did not speak fast. He spoke like a man laying boards across a gap one at a time because that was the only safe way across. He said, "I returned it because it was his." That quote belonged to the sorrow current because of what followed. He also said later, "I kept thinking if I got loud, nobody would hear the truth." I heard in that sentence how much he already knew about the room he had been arrested in and the world outside it. During cross-examination, defense counsel tried to ask whether Luis had been angry. He answered with more honesty than strategy. He said, "Yes, I was angry, but anger was not the worst part. The worst part was my daughter watching me answer for a lie that was not mine." That was the sentence that made Marisol, his wife, close her eyes in the gallery and press both hands together under her chin. From the bench, I could see her wedding ring flash once under the lights. The defense did not come in pretending Daniel Mercer had done nothing wrong. That mattered to me. His lawyer, Elise Rowan, was clear from the start. She said Daniel acted out of panic, pride, and a habit of believing his first fear faster than other people's humanity. Then she said something I did not expect. She said, "My client does not need this court to protect his image. He needs this court to interrupt his pattern." That sentence belonged to the grace current, not because it was gentle, but because it was true enough to be useful. Still, defense could not resolve what the sorrow current contained. It could not return Luis's lost wages. It could not take the handcuffs out of Sophia's memory. It could not make the internet forget a rumor once it had been fed. It could not explain why a man who had just done an honest thing became so easy to suspect the moment a rich man pointed at him. Those facts stood there on their own legs. When Daniel testified, he began in the voice I know too well, controlled, clean, a little too polished. Then the prosecutor asked why he said what he said before checking his coat, his car, or anything else. Daniel looked down at the table for so long I thought he might not answer. Then he said, "I made his honesty carry my fear." I wrote it down. I looked at it for a long time. Both things I was feeling were in that one sentence. I did not expect that. A little later he said, "I knew, even while I was saying it, that I was making him pay for something I had not even checked." That quote belonged to the sorrow current because it named the harm plainly. Then, on redirect, when Elise asked why he called at midnight instead of waiting to speak through counsel, he said, "Because every extra minute was still hurting him." That one belonged to the grace current. None of them erased the others. That was the point. The convergence point came on the fourth day when the state introduced a timeline chart. On the left were the times of the 911 call, the arrest, the booking, the missed shift, the rent notice, and the school counselor visit. On the right were the midnight voicemail, Daniel's written admission, the first restitution payment, and the treatment intake appointment he made before any plea talks began. One board, same case. Two currents flowing toward one place where I would have to answer both. I need to place a memory beside this because it rose in me while I listened, and it belongs here more honestly than any neat explanation would. I was 12 when my mother dropped a glass casserole dish on our kitchen floor the week after my grandfather died. It broke clean in the middle and then into smaller pieces. She stood there looking at it with a dish towel in her hand, not moving. Then my aunt came in from the porch, got down on her knees without saying anything, and started picking up the pieces one by one. My mother knelt too. The two of them worked in silence until the floor was clear. I remember the sound of ceramic against the metal dustpan. I remember learning that some forms of care arrive after the break and do not insult it by pretending it never happened. I just realized saying that now that I have never told that memory in connection with a case before. Subscribe. That matters more than I knew when I started speaking. Subscribe now. By the time we reached verdict, I had the law in front of me and the people behind it fully in view. The room before I ruled was very quiet. Luis had both hands wrapped around a paper cup of water he was no longer drinking from. Daniel was not looking at me. He was looking at the edge of the defense table as if it were the only line in the room he trusted. My left hand was open on the bench. My right thumb rested on the corner of the file. I paused for 17 seconds before I spoke. I know, because I glanced at the clock above the rear doors and watched the second hand move. I had decided carefully. I had decided knowing that the ruling had to hold the weight of what was lost and also leave room for what might still happen. Those two things do not always fit in the same sentence. In this case they did, and I had made sure they did. I found Daniel Mercer guilty of filing a false report and guilty of unlawful use of emergency services. I said it plainly. Luis closed his eyes once and let air out slowly. Daniel lowered his head and stayed still. In the second row, Sophia reached for her mother's sleeve and did not let go. That was the first reaction I saw, and it carried both currents in it. The child still hurt, the child still anchored. Sentencing came on September 6, 2024. I had the pre-sentence report, treatment records, letters from both families, wage records, counseling invoices, and a proposed restorative plan from a certified conference facilitator. People think sentencing is where the talking ends. It is not. It is where a judge has to say what accountability looks like when pain is real and change is still possible. I said, Mr. Mercer, I am ordering you to pay $31 and 60 in restitution to Luis Mendoza and his family within 120 days and a separate $12,000 fine to the East Valley Immigrant Family Defense Fund within 180 days. That money is for lost wages, counseling for Sofia Mendoza, legal costs, late rent fees, and the practical damage your lie set in motion. Money does not repair trust, but it can repair the ground that trust was knocked off of. I said, I am also ordering 320 hours of in-person service at the East Valley Workers Center over 16 months, not board service, not donations. Your time, your labor, your name signed in at a folding table where day laborers and their families come for wage help, translation help, and document replacement. You used your certainty to make an honest man smaller in public. You will now spend time making other people's public burden lighter. I said, I am ordering a 52-week accountability program, individual therapy, alcohol monitoring for 6 months, and a bias intervention course approved by probation. The evidence showed me you are not confused about right and wrong. The problem is how quickly your fear found permission when money and status were standing behind it. This part of the sentence is designed to slow that down before it ever reaches another person. Then I said, and there is one more thing. Every 90 days, if Mr. Mendoza agrees each time, you will attend a structured restorative conference with him and a trained facilitator. Between those meetings, you will write one letter through probation naming one specific harm you caused and one specific action you took that month to become less dangerous with your fear. You are not to ask for forgiveness. You are to stay in contact with the truth. I also gave him a condition for early completion. I said that after 14 months, if every dollar was paid, at least 280 service hours were complete, treatment was finished, every letter had been submitted on time, and the director of the Workers' Center confirmed in writing that Daniel Mercer had shown up consistently and never once tried to use money, influence, or private pressure to bend the terms of service, he could petition for early termination of probation. That was the closest I could come from the bench to saying I still believed effort mattered. Then I told him what I needed him to hear in the clearest words I had. I said, what you did was not a misunderstanding. You took a man's honest act and turned it into danger for his home. I said, to the Mendoza family, this court sees the full size of what was taken from you that night, and it was more than ours. I said, Mr. Mercer, the charges tell me what you did, but they do not contain all that you are, and that is exactly why I expect more from you than shame. I looked at the room and said, everyone here has seen how quickly fear can borrow authority and become harm. Then I ended the way I needed to. I said, the truth does not become less true because the wrong person says it first. I want to stop here for just a moment, not for effect, because what I just repeated is still sitting with me, and I need 1 second to feel its full weight. Subscribe while I take that second. Subscribe and stay. All right, let me finish this. When the courtroom began to empty, I stayed seated, the way judges do, and watched. Luis stood slowly and gathered his papers with both hands. Daniel remained at counsel table until his daughter, Claire, stepped forward and placed her hand on his shoulder, not to rescue him, to steady him. Near the gallery rail, Sophia leaned up toward her father and whispered, so returning it was still right? Luis bent down and said, yes, mija, still right. I heard that from the bench and I have never forgotten it. Before I stood, I did one small thing. I straightened the top page of the file and rested my palm over Daniel's apology letter for one brief second. It was just paper under my hand. That is exactly why I did it. I wanted to remember that the sentence would only matter if it moved from words into weight, from paper into a life actually lived. On December 14, 2024, I received a compliance update through probation. Daniel had completed 96 hours at the Workers' Center and paid the first half of restitution on time. The report included one line from the center director, Elena Cruz. She wrote that during a Saturday supply drive, a child's backpack strap broke and Daniel repaired it with a zip tie from the intake desk before loading food boxes into the family's trunk. The child was Sophia. Luis was standing 2 steps away when it happened. Nothing about that date erased June 14th. The lie was still part of the story. The handcuffs were still part of it. So was the fact that the man who caused that harm was now standing in a place where he could not hide from what repair actually feels like: repetitive, visible, humbling, useful. Both currents were still there. There was an appeal. Daniel Mercer challenged the service requirement and the restorative conference condition in the Arizona Court of Appeals, Division 1. On August 19, 2025, that court affirmed the sentence in full. In plain language, it said the conditions fit the proven harm, the defendant's own admissions, and the trial court's duty to reduce the chance of the same conduct happening again. It took a little over 11 months. When I heard, I felt steadier, not relieved cleanly, just steadier. You just heard what I said to him and what happened after. Hold that for a second. Subscribe before we go further, because what this case changed in me is the part I still live with. Subscribe now. This case showed me that holding 2 feelings at once is not weakness and not confusion. Sometimes it is the only honest way to stand in front of human beings and not flatten them into one lesson. If I had ruled only from sorrow, I might have answered pain without building anything. If I had ruled only from grace, I would have betrayed pain. The sentence had to be wide enough for both. I have seen versions of this pattern before. A mother harmed by her son still tells the court his favorite childhood meal because love did not disappear when safety did. A man who drove drunk hears the victim's brother ask for treatment before prison because he wants one less funeral in the world. The law meets people at the act. What makes the act worth judging is that a whole life keeps arriving around it. There is one thing I have never said in any other professional setting. This case is the one that made it true in me. There are days when I leave the bench and I am not sure the law was enough for the life that stood in front of it. In this case, for once, I believed it might have been enough to begin. If you are someone who knows the sorrow current in this story, I want to speak carefully to you. I am not going to tell you that harm makes people noble. Most days it just makes breathing feel like work. What I saw in Luis Mendoza was not some clean holiness. It was the labor of staying human after another person tried to make his decency look dangerous. That labor was real, and I saw it every time he answered plainly, instead of performing pain for the room. And still, over the course of the case, I watched something in him remain untouched by what had been done to him, not unharmed, untouched in a different way. The accusation did not take his steadiness. The handcuffs did not take his ability to tell the truth without shouting. The proceedings did not take the part of him that still bent down to tie his daughter's shoe. That matters. It mattered to me. If you are someone who recognizes yourself more in the defendant's chair, then hear me with the same honesty. I am not speaking about accidents with no blame inside them. I am speaking about the moment when fear, pride, class, race, shame, or anger moved through you and landed on somebody else's harm. I have watched many people sit where Daniel sat. The ones who moved toward a better life all did one thing the others would not do. They stopped protecting the story that made their behavior feel justified. That is what separates regret from change. Not tears, not eloquent apologies, not how bad you feel about what you now know. It is whether you can stay close enough to the truth to become useful after it. If I could say one thing to every person who ever stood before me after causing real harm, it would be this. The worst thing you did is not the only true thing about you, but it will become the biggest thing if you keep feeding it excuses. 3 months after I sentenced Daniel Mercer, Luis Mendoza stopped in the hallway outside courtroom 4B and said, "Vio, my daughter sleeps again." He said it quietly. He said it like a father setting down a weight that had been in his arms too long. That is why I told you this story. Subscribe and stay. Tell me in the comments about a moment when grief and grace had to stand in the same room, because that is where people who can bear both tend to find one another.